Modeling had always been one of those things that quietly fascinated me. My mother had spent most of her career as a respected photographer in the fashion and modeling world, so I had grown up around cameras, studios, makeup artists, lighting equipment, and people constantly preparing for photo shoots. During my teenage years, she occasionally brought me along to work, and before long, I found myself appearing in a few shoots whenever they needed someone with my build. I was unusually tall for my age and naturally slim, with a sharp jawline, clear skin, and the kind of features my mother insisted photographers would love. She repeatedly told me that I had the appearance of a model, but I never took her comments particularly seriously. To me, modeling was simply something interesting I did occasionally rather than something I could build a career around. After graduating from college, I decided to take a completely different path and enter the finance industry. At first, the job seemed like a sensible choice. The salary was good, the work was stable, and everyone around me seemed impressed that I had landed a position in such a competitive field. But after spending enough time sitting behind a desk and repeating the same routine every week, I began to realize how much I disliked it. The long hours, endless meetings, spreadsheets, and pressure gradually wore me down. I started wondering whether I had chosen the wrong career simply because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. Eventually, I decided I had nothing to lose by giving modeling another chance. By that point, my mother had retired from photography, but she still knew plenty of people throughout the industry. When I told her I wanted to explore modeling seriously, she was surprisingly excited. She dug through her old contacts and handed me several phone numbers belonging to photographers, agents, and studio owners she trusted. At the time, I was living in New York, so I started calling the numbers one after another. Most of the calls went unanswered. A few numbers were no longer active, and after several attempts produced nothing useful, I eventually stopped thinking about it. Then, several weeks later, my phone rang. The caller introduced herself as Julia. She explained that she was an experienced photographer and was currently preparing a private shoot for an extremely wealthy client. The client wanted a collection of exclusive photographs for his residence, and Julia was looking for someone with my particular appearance. I was immediately curious. The idea of someone paying for a collection of professional photographs to display inside a private home sounded unusual, but it was still legitimate paid modeling work. Julia told me that she had seen some of my older work and believed I could be a good fit. I agreed to meet her. On the morning of the shoot, I kept my outfit simple. I wore jeans and a plain shirt because Julia had specifically told me that the studio would provide everything necessary for the session. I arrived about 15 minutes before our scheduled time and found myself standing outside an impressive studio building in Manhattan. Julia was waiting near the entrance. She looked close to my age and was dressed in a loose summer dress. As soon as she saw me, she smiled. "Hi, I'm Julia. I like the outfit." I introduced myself, and after a brief greeting, she invited me inside. As we walked through the building, Julia asked about my previous experience. I told her about growing up around my mother's photography career, the small modeling jobs I had done when I was younger, and my decision to leave finance behind. When I mentioned my mother, Julia's expression changed. She told me that she actually knew my mother and had worked with her years earlier. That immediately made me feel more comfortable. Julia explained that she had eventually left the company she worked for and established her own studio. She had apparently built a very successful business and now handled high-profile photography projects for private clients. We stepped into an elevator. Julia pressed the button for the 41st floor. As the elevator climbed, she continued explaining how important this particular project was. According to her, the entire floor had been converted into one enormous photography facility. If everything went well, she said, she could potentially recommend me for several other assignments. That caught my attention. I had originally gone into the shoot hoping to make a little money and gain some experience, but suddenly it seemed like I might actually be standing in front of a serious opportunity. When the elevator doors opened, I understood what she meant. The entire floor had been transformed into a massive studio. Different sections had been arranged into separate sets, with professional cameras, enormous lights, backdrops, equipment cases, and changing areas scattered throughout the space. It was far more elaborate than any shoot I had previously experienced. Julia led me toward one of the prepared stages. At first, nothing about the setup seemed particularly unusual, except for one strange detail. There was a tall pole positioned directly in the middle of the stage. Julia instructed me to stand beside it. I followed her directions while she adjusted the lighting and camera settings. She photographed me from several angles, asking me to change my posture and expression. After a few minutes, she asked me to lean against the pole. I did as instructed. Then she gave me another pose. Put your hands around the pole and close your eyes. I hesitated for a second. It was certainly not a pose I had encountered before, but I assumed this was simply part of the unusual concept she had mentioned. I wrapped my hands around the pole and closed my eyes. Keep them closed, Julia said. A moment later, I felt something tighten around my wrists. There was a distinct metallic sound. Click. My eyes immediately opened. I looked down and realized that my wrists had been secured to the pole. I pulled instinctively and stared at Julia in disbelief. Hey, what is this? Instead of looking concerned, Julia simply smiled. Relax. We're adding a few bonus photographs to the session. I couldn't understand why she had done it without warning me. Julia quickly reassured me that these additional photographs would come with extra compensation. When I asked how much, she casually mentioned $5,000. I honestly thought I had misheard her. $5,000 was an enormous amount compared with what someone at my level normally earned from a single modeling assignment. The number immediately changed my perspective. I agreed to continue, although I still had questions about exactly what the shoot involved. Julia stepped closer. I tried asking what kind of photographs the client wanted, and why the unusual setup was necessary. Before I could get an answer, she placed a strip of duct tape over my mouth. This is going to be a silent photo session, she said. No more questions. I stared at her, completely stunned. Before I could process what was happening, I heard the elevator doors opening behind us. 2 additional women stepped onto the floor. Both appeared to be around Julia's age and were dressed in similarly fashionable outfits. Julia introduced them as Nicole and Lauren, explaining that they were her assistants and would be helping with the wardrobe portion of the shoot. The 2 women approached me carrying equipment and supplies. The situation was becoming increasingly strange. Nicole pulled a pair of scissors from her bag, and before I fully understood what she intended to do, she began cutting away the clothing I had arrived in. Lauren helped with the wardrobe preparation, making sure the outfit was removed without damaging the rest of the studio equipment. Soon, my original clothes were gone, leaving me in my basic undergarments. I had no idea what kind of modeling session I had actually agreed to. Nicole returned carrying a large bag filled with beauty supplies. At the same time, Lauren began taking professional measurements, recording everything carefully as though this had been planned long before I arrived. The entire process felt highly organized. That was what made it even more unsettling. Lauren then brought over a black disposable cover and positioned it over my face in a way that concealed the tape without interfering with the upcoming photographs. I could hear Julia preparing her camera. The 3 women moved around the stage, checking the lights and equipment while I stood there trying to understand how a normal modeling audition had turned into something so completely unexpected. Then Julia raised her camera. She looked directly toward me and smiled. Ready? I wasn't sure I was. Julia began counting. 3. The studio suddenly became quiet. 2. The camera was already recording. 1. Julia pressed the record button. She looked toward the lens with the confidence of someone beginning a carefully planned production. Welcome back, everyone. And in that moment, I realized that whatever this mysterious photo shoot was supposed to become, it was only just beginning. Today, we're going to be doing a male-to-female transformation tutorial. We have a wonderful volunteer with us who is ready to explore his feminine side. Julia delivered the introduction directly into the camera, and the moment she finished, all 3 women laughed. I stood there completely confused, still trying to understand how a simple modeling opportunity had turned into something I had never agreed to. Lauren and Nicole immediately began working on my appearance while Julia moved around the camera, explaining everything to whoever might eventually watch the recording. Lauren carefully shaped my eyebrows with tweezers while Nicole prepared the next part of the makeover. Julia continued narrating as though this were an ordinary beauty tutorial. Then Lauren brought out a collection of waxing supplies. Before long, she was removing the hair from my arms and legs, working methodically from one area to another. The process took far longer than I expected. By the time she finished, I barely recognized the person standing in front of the camera. Lauren wrapped a towel around me while Nicole prepared the next stage. I tried to ask what they intended to do next, but the mask over my mouth made my words nearly impossible to understand. The entire situation felt surreal. What had started as a modeling job was becoming an elaborate transformation that seemed to have been planned long before I walked into the building. Nicole eventually returned with a bright yellow piece of clothing and instructed me to step into it. I reluctantly followed her directions while Lauren and Julia watched. The three women laughed again when they saw my reaction. Then they continued with the makeover. A matching top was added, along with padding designed to change my silhouette. My hair was secured underneath a net, and decorative earrings were attached. Nicole carefully applied artificial nails over my own, while Lauren prepared a pair of patterned stockings. When they finally placed a shoulder-length brown wig over my head, I caught a glimpse of myself in one of the studio mirrors. For the first time since this strange ordeal had begun, I actually paused. The person looking back at me seemed completely different. The wig framed my face differently. The makeup and altered eyebrows changed my expression, and the new outfit gave me an appearance I had never seen on myself before. I felt embarrassed, confused, and strangely fascinated all at once. Nicole then brought out a coordinated checkered skirt and matching top. Julia immediately turned toward the camera. "And here we have our little school-inspired look," she announced enthusiastically. "Definitely one of the cutest transformations we've done." I wanted to disappear. Instead, the cameras started flashing. Julia and her assistants moved around me, photographing me from different angles. They kept adjusting my posture and giving me different instructions for each picture. Then Julia brought over a fan as part of the next photography setup. She positioned it beneath the stage and switched it on, causing the fabric of the skirt to move dramatically in the air. I instinctively tried to hold the outfit in place. The women laughed, and Julia continued taking photographs. Lauren then instructed me to try several different poses. I followed her directions as best I could, moving from one pose to another while Julia captured everything with her camera. I couldn't believe how quickly the situation had escalated. Then Julia turned on some upbeat music. "All right," she said, gesturing toward the pole. "Let's see you move around it." I simply stood there. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. Julia looked annoyed. "Come on. The camera is rolling." I remained still. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Do you want these pictures uploaded online?" I immediately shook my head. That was enough. I began moving around the pole, awkwardly at first, trying to follow the rhythm of the music while the cameras continued recording. Julia seemed satisfied. After several minutes, she finally switched off the music. The next costume was already waiting. Lauren returned carrying a completely different outfit. This time, it was a maid-inspired costume. She helped me change into it while Nicole brought over a pair of black heels. I had never worn heels before, and standing in them was much harder than it looked. Nicole gave me a quick lesson on how to balance. "Small steps," she instructed. I carefully moved across the studio while Julia photographed me again. The camera never seemed to stop. Julia whispered something to Nicole, and Nicole immediately nodded before walking over to me. I knew from the expression on her face that another part of the strange photo session was about to begin. They continued directing me through different poses while Julia documented everything. The fan came back out again, and Lauren positioned it beneath the costume to create dramatic movement in the fabric. The whole experience had become humiliating and overwhelming. I kept wondering why I had agreed to any of this. Eventually, the three women seemed satisfied with the number of photographs they had taken. They restored the previous clothing layer, removed the costume, and began preparing to finish the session. Then Julia made a phone call. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I clearly heard her give instructions to Lauren and Nicole. A moment later, they returned to the restraints that had been keeping me in place. One by one, they unlocked them. For the first time in what felt like hours, I was free to move without being attached to the stage. I thought the nightmare was finally over. Then the elevator doors opened. Two security guards stepped onto the floor. Julia immediately rushed toward them. "Please remove this man from the building," she told them. "We caught him sneaking in here and trying on some of the outfits." I stared at her in disbelief. "What?" The tape still prevented me from speaking clearly. Before I could explain anything, the guards approached me and took hold of my arms. I tried desperately to communicate that I had been invited there for a paid modeling assignment, but nobody seemed interested in hearing my side. They escorted me toward the elevator. As we passed through the building, I became painfully aware of all the people watching. Employees and visitors in the lobby turned their heads. Some stared openly. Others whispered to one another. I had never felt so exposed or humiliated in my life. The guards eventually led me through the main entrance and pushed me outside. "Don't come back," one of them said. Then the doors closed behind me. I immediately pulled off the mask and tore away the tape that had been covering my mouth. I turned back toward the building. "My clothes," I shouted. But the guards had already disappeared inside. The entrance doors locked. I stood on the sidewalk wearing only the remaining pieces of the costume, completely stunned by what had just happened. I couldn't go back inside. I couldn't call anyone. And I couldn't exactly walk through Manhattan looking like that. So I started running. I kept my head down and moved as quickly as I could.
People looked at me as I passed.
Some shouted comments, while others simply stared in confusion. I tried to ignore everyone. Then I heard sirens. My heart began pounding. I looked behind me and saw police vehicles approaching. Panic took over. I ran faster. I didn't stop to think about where I was going. I simply wanted to get somewhere private. Eventually, I reached Central Park. I kept running through the paths, hearing footsteps and distant sirens behind me. Fortunately, I had always been a fast runner. I pushed myself harder than I ever had before, turning corners and cutting through the park until I was certain nobody was following me anymore. Eventually, I made it back toward my apartment. By the time I reached my building, I was exhausted. I rushed upstairs, unlocked my door, stumbled inside, and immediately locked it behind me. For several minutes, I simply stood there breathing heavily. I looked at myself in the mirror. The wig was crooked. The makeup was smudged. The carefully created transformation from the studio was still visible, but none of it felt exciting anymore. All I could think about was how easily a promising modeling opportunity had turned into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I never understood why Julia had chosen me, or what the wealthy client actually wanted those photographs for. I never found out what happened to the pictures either. And perhaps the strangest part of the entire story was what happened afterward. I never told my mother. I never told my friends. I never contacted Julia again. And I never walked into another professional photo studio. For years, I kept the entire experience to myself. Whenever someone mentioned modeling, I immediately changed the subject. That one afternoon had completely changed the way I looked at the industry. I had entered that building believing I was finally getting the opportunity to pursue a career I had once been curious about. I left believing that I had made one of the biggest mistakes of my life. And even now, whenever I remember those elevator doors opening and the security guards stepping onto that floor, I still wonder what would have happened if I had never answered Julia's phone call in the first place. Anyway, that's where my story ends. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd also love to know what kind of story you'd like to hear next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.